Allahu Akbar.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. My mother was born and raised in Scotland. She came to the United States in the late 1960s. As she tells it, her first major impression of America was looking out of an airplane's window and seeing fires burning along the Detroit skyline. It was a time of great unhappiness in the United States. The 1967 riot in Detroit resulted in 43 dead, 467 injured, and damage estimates in the range of $40 to $60 million. The president appointed a commission to look into the causes of those riots, and they released a report in 1968. It has a very famous passage in it. Our nation, this is quoting from the report, our nation is moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. So the question I'm here to discuss today is struggling for civil rights, the pursuit of happiness, has a very easy answer. Happiness is very difficult in an unjust and unequal society. Our nation's founders understood this reality. And given our topic this weekend, I'm sure you've heard the famous line from the Declaration of Independence many times, talking about rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But I want you to hear what they wrote after that. And this is quoting from the Declaration of Independence. That to secure these rights, life, liberty, happiness, governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to effect their safety and happiness. So in laying out the justification for breaking from the British Empire, no small step, the nation's founders argue that a government needs to be organized in a fashion most likely to allow those living under it to be safe and happy. If you read further, you find a list of the reasons that they chose to break away from the British Empire. And one of those reasons is this. He, referring to King George, has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. Now, I always love that line, manly firmness. The founding fathers were good for, strong language. But what they're saying is a government should be there to make sure that people are safe and happy. And part of the government's job is to make sure it's protecting the rights of the people. And if you want people to be happy in a society, they have to have those rights. Happiness, again, is difficult in an unjust society. So why are we talking about this today? None of what I've just said is particularly shocking to anybody in this room, right? That's all basic civics. But here's the key for you today. American Muslims, our community, are currently on the front lines of protecting the Constitution and its ideals of a just and equal society. I know sometimes it doesn't feel that way given the pressure that's on us. And I want to prove my point to you. Because there are people out there right now, Islamophobes, Pamela Geller, David Yerushalmi, Robert Spencer, who want to move our society toward what that 1968 report was talking about. Remember the one? We're talking about two societies that are separate but unequal. But now there's a new target. There's a new religious minority that's the target. And I want to prove that to you. First of all, we're going to talk about efforts to legislate government-sanctioned discrimination against Muslims. In 2011 and 2012, 78 bills or amendments aimed at interfering with Islamic religious practices were considered in 29 states and the US Congress. So we're no longer talking about, I hate to use the term, but run-of-the-mill discrimination. We're talking about attempts to build it into the law of the land. 62 of the bills that were considered contained language that was extracted from Islamophobe David Yerushalmi's American Laws for American Courts. Now, Yerushalmi is on the record making anti-Muslim, anti-black, anti-Jewish, anti-woman statements, and yet somehow this man's model legislation was considered in legislatures across this country. 73 of the bills were introduced solely by Republicans, and I'm not talking fringe legislators here. In too many cases, those introducing these bills were part of a party leadership in the states. They were signed into law, so these anti-Muslim bills were signed into law in Arizona, Kansas, South Dakota, Tennessee, Oklahoma, Louisiana. 6 states have passed laws whose intention is to interfere with the practices of our faith. Now, I want to be very clear with you. These people say they're passing their laws because their assertion is that Sharia, Islamic religious principles, is a threat to the United States and is somehow taking over the country. I would argue to you that these bills are being passed for nothing more than anti-Muslim sentiment. That's what's behind them. And I want you to listen a little bit to what's in these bills. In Tennessee, the bill's original definition of Sharia was in practical terms the entire religion of Islam. It said that Sharia comes from any of the authoritative schools of Islamic jurisprudence, Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi, Hanbali, Jafariya, or Salafi. Now, they don't even know the schools of jurisprudence, but that's what they listed. So essentially what they're saying is if you're a practicing Muslim, it would have been illegal to be one in Tennessee. In South Dakota, the bill's sponsor told an audience, "It is alarming how many of our sisters and daughters who attend American universities are now marrying Muslim men." So they may argue that they're trying to protect America, but when you listen to their words, the bigotry is clear. Now, they don't even know what they're talking about half the time. And just as a singular example, in Alabama, when they asked the sponsor of the bill what Sharia is, his response was, "I don't have my notes in front of me. Talk to my legislative staff." So they did. They called his legislative staff and they said, "You know what? This definition looks a lot like the one that's found in Wikipedia. So why does your definition of Sharia look like the one from Wikipedia?" And their response was, "'Cause, well, that's where we got it." So college students will tell you that citing Wikipedia will get you a bad grade on your paper. But apparently in some states, it makes for good legislating. Texas legislator Leo Berman said his bill was necessary because he had heard, so he didn't check it out, he heard that one American town was allowing judges to use Sharia. So I'm quoting him now. "I heard it on a radio station on my way to the Capitol." So dude's just listening to the radio on his way in with work one day. "That Sharia law is accepted in Dearborn, Michigan." Isn't that true? So he introduced a bill to try to interfere in our faith because he heard something on the radio and didn't bother to check it out. CARE is on the forefront of efforts to reject this legislation. And I want to just tell you really quickly, when they passed the bill in Oklahoma, we sued them 2 days later because the bill specifically mentioned Islam. And our arguments in our lawsuit are based on the First Amendment and the Supremacy Clause. And the interesting thing that happened is we were immediately attacked for trying to undermine the Constitution of the United States. So here I am in court going, the First Amendment protects us from attacks on our religion like this, and I'm being told you guys are trying to undermine the Constitution. So far, 4 federal judges have ruled in our favor, and the bill in that state is on hold, and we're on course to make sure that that bill will never be implemented. In the other states that we're talking about, that I mentioned, the bills that were actually passed are so watered down that they really have no world effect. So we have chosen not to challenge them at this point until we see that somebody's actually trying to use them against our faith. Let me give you one other area where we have an example of why we need to be concerned and why we need to be standing up for civil rights if we want to ensure happiness in this society. Let's talk about the recent presidential election. Herman Cain was for a while the front runner in the GOP's presidential nominating process. Does everybody remember him? Godfather's Pizza, CEO. Speaking to Christianity Today in March of 2011, Cain said, "Followers of the Muslim religion have an objective to convert all infidels or kill them." He also said that Muslims who wanted to serve in his administration would have to take loyalty oaths. And then he explained on Fox News that he wouldn't require similar oaths from Mormons or Catholics because there is a greater, dangerous part of the Muslim faith than there is in these religions. Hate to keep bringing this document up, I know it's kind of annoying, but the Constitution of the United States, it's inconvenient for these guys. Article 6 says there is no religious test for public office. Your religion doesn't matter. You can't ask about it. So this guy, Herman Cain, is advancing a notion on the campaign trail of undermining Article 6 of the Constitution by having Muslims take loyalty oaths. Did he get booed off the stage? Were people like, no, we can't have that? What he got was applause. Rick Santorum, another front runner, endorsed religious profiling in one of the debates, saying obviously Muslims were someone you would look at. And then in a lengthy Islamophobic rant he had given in 2007, he asserted that in order to win against a vaguely defined Muslim enemy, Americans must educate, evangelize, engage, and eradicate. So here we have fear driving a conversation in law and on the presidential campaign trail that's resulting in undermining of the Constitution. And nobody else is going to stand up for us. It's our job to defend that Constitution. Threats like this to each person's equal right to liberty are not new in America. We've been talking a lot about the Constitution. As originally enacted, it treated black people as 3/5 of a human being. A very famous clause was eventually solved during the Civil War. Women were denied the right of basic treatment, equal treatment. They weren't allowed to vote in presidential elections until 1920. But what happened is people stood up, they pushed back, and they made sure that people's rights were respected. Even after slavery ended, African Americans were subjected to horrible treatment. But here's the interesting thing that happened. They didn't hide. Reverend Martin Luther King, we all know his name, right? He was wiretapped. The FBI, in a memo, called him the most dangerous and effective Negro leader in America. The head of the FBI called him a degenerate. And now we have his birthday off as a federal holiday. He didn't hide. They stood up and they pushed back. Japanese Americans, they were put in internment camps after Pearl Harbor. And I think we have them to thank for the fact that we weren't subjected to something similar. They pushed back. It took them 40 years, but the government eventually recognized that what they were doing was wrong, that what was done to them was wrong, and apologized. So we have models before us that show us that standing up, pushing back is the thing to do. And today, it's our turn to push back. Why? Because tomorrow, it's going to be someone else. Guaranteed, right? Immigration reform is on the table in Washington, D.C. right now. I can guarantee you that the lens of discrimination is going to switch to the Hispanic community for a while. If we don't stand up and push back and defend constitutional liberties and ensure happiness for everyone, then someone down the road is going to look and they're going to go, you know what? In the 1850s, when it was the Catholics stood up and pushed back. Then in the 1920s, when it was the Jews primarily, the Jews stood up and they pushed back. And the Mormons pushed back, and the Japanese pushed back, and the African Americans pushed back. We don't want them to say, when it was the Muslims' turn, they didn't push back. So it's our turn, it's our responsibility. We will push back. We will defend the Constitution against people who are going to accuse us of undermining it, so that when we pass the torch to someone else, their rights are protected, and we're there to help them, because we don't want what happened to us to happen to someone else. Because if we're going to be happy, everybody else has to be happy. Thank you.